And we are live. Welcome, everybody. Here we go again. Another episode of us going through a whole chapter of language of creation. Because, yeah, there's a lot there. Uh, I feel things are coming together. Less resistance on my side. Um, some moves on Matthieu's sides, which I highly approve of. So, um, that gives me hope for the rest of the book. Also, rough reads, still rough reads. Um, as for myself, I started fasting this week, so kind of struggling with that. Um, it's interesting to take the dreaming, working perspective on fasting, and it's like there's some of both in there, right? Because like you need to hold fast, hold on to your fast. Um, but also like it will break your patterns. It will submerge you into a new way of being. Um, and all of that is in some sense it's weighing on me. So like I'm tired. So I had my intention of last week waking up, and I'm gonna continue it into this week because I kind of well during the week I kind of had a few experiences how that spiritually would be the case waking up. So there's when things are weighing on you, right? Like you can see it's like you're covered by a blanket or you're covered by water by the flood, right? And when you're covered, you're not in control, right? Like there's a an adherence that you have to with the covering. Like so, having a headache, I have a headache today is kind of like that, right? Because like the headache is oppressing you and it's preventing you from participating. Um, and there's ways of relating to that, ways of having the headache where it's in the background, like it's not on on top of you, but it's more behind you or below you. Um, and so there's yeah, there's a way in which you get to move yourself, I guess, spiritually uh, from away from under there and into a different location. Because I just came from church and I kind of had that experience, right? Like through like what was it, 2 hours of worship, right? Like kind of you change the way that you're relating to something, right? So the headache is still there, the oppression is still there, but the quality of it is different and gets diminished. So I guess that's my experience of what we're dealing with. Because oh yeah, well that would be waking up, and I'll make more references later on when we go to the book. Mark.
Sure. So, yeah, I really liked, again, we're getting more into the practical nature of the principles that he's talking about, right? He's really disambiguating what he means, folded the diagrams in a bit so that you can see that more clearly. And I appreciated the way he's mapping the dreaming to the working. And there's sort of no other state, right? You're either asleep or working. It's like and asleep is dreaming, and dreaming is self-referential and therefore dangerous. So I thought all that was kind of good to know at some point. So yeah, in as usual, I mean, there's a couple in the upcoming chapter of just whopping statements that I probably people brushed over without sort of realizing the significance of what he's saying. So um, hopefully, hopefully everybody noticed, but if not, I'm eager to find out and eager to point it out if it was missed. Um, but yeah, the level of contemplation around around, you know, the symbolism of standing up versus laying down, and all of that is sort of folded in. Christopher?
Yeah. Dylan, what I've written here is still standing. There's a bit of yeah, events going on that are very time time flood oriented. Had to deal with my car breaking down and fixing that, and so, but we're still here and still moving forward. So, Alina.
My intention is still the same from last time, just to understand more about the mediation of the dream and the process of waking up. This Manuel is kind of seems to be getting to that. So the process of waking up and getting everybody's take and opinion on that. I think Castle's left.
Sure. So my intention here is, well, I just have myself labeled as half asleep. So, which is interesting because as things turned out, I showed up and I only heard half of everyone's, intentions and kind of starting reflections and everything. And so that's actually fine. I don't want anyone to tell me what I missed, so that I could kind of participate in this intention a little better. But I've been kind of thinking about a little bit of this sort of like the momentary transitional state wherein you're kind of like just not really doing either of those things. I've actually been experiencing this a lot, especially within the last week. Interestingly, the sort of thing of being like half asleep or kind of like going in and out and being like, oh, wait a second, like, I thought I was in the middle of this thing, or, oh, trying to actually get from the state of lying down to standing up, and just unbelievable amount of effort needing to be kind of expended there, or also kind of the trade-off of actually needing time in order to kind of get out of the effects of time or something like that. So just kind of thinking on that a little bit. I think that'll kind of as I wake up here, so will my reflections.
Okay. Then we'll get into it. Thank you for participating, Mitchell. I hope you'll hang around in the comments, and we'll properly treat any contributions. So, yeah, so I started at the quote from the Bible in this chapter, right? We're doing sleeping or working, and it starts off with God made the human fall asleep. So it's interesting, right? It's an imposition. Sleep is not something that the human asks for or participates in, or it gets imposed upon him. And so you could analogize that with entropy, right? Like change is inevitable. So like God is just gonna make that happen to you. And then took one of its sides. So I've been thinking about this, right? Because it to become one flesh, right? So there's a ripping apart and there's a unification after the ripping, right? So uh, like I'm making it analogous to separating the heavens, the firmament, right? Like it's like creating the space, right? Like the separation is allowing one entity to have a relationship to the other entity. They gain separate identities, and in the having of separate identities, they can combine in a manner that wasn't possible before. So there's well, that in some sense that's the the building of another fractal layer, right? The separation there, um, and then close the flesh in its place. So I don't really know what that's referencing. Maybe someone has an idea about that.
Well, so I really do like this this kind of calling back to the separation of the waters, also going along with the kind of separating of, you know, the woman out of the man, but also thinking about, you know, as you mentioned with the sort of fractal layers, we're also seeing that it's literally happening, like the microcosm is taking place on Adam's side as well. And so you have that kind of happening. It's interesting because in a lot of the translations, like people infer rib, but it seems like that's not actually a direct translation. It's that the side was opened, and then after there was that separation, then it was like kind of, you know, and of course this is a silly sort of like materialistic analogy, you know, but I'm just kind of thinking, if you look at some of those like 3D modeling programs and stuff where you go and you kind of like extrude out of something, or you copy something and then you just remove it out of the side, and just kind of thinking of that process, you know, not, you know, kind of try to theorize God's dev tools or something like that, but just kind of this interesting aspect of, okay, it's not like, if you could assume you could take an entire human being out of a rib, like you could do it at a less at that point. And like I've even heard people kind of say this thing of like, oh, you know, and it's a misunderstanding also of like evolution of how, you know, you can actually lose a rib. Like that doesn't mean that your children lose ribs or anything like that. I've heard some people kind of make theories that were incorrect about that, but just kind of thinking of this, you know, once you've kind of separated the waters, or you've separated, you know, the ocean from the, you know, the upper heavens, or whatever you will, that there is then kind of like a there is a little bit of a resealing. Like we talked about, the sealing or kind of like a stamp of approval. So in a sense, like there is kind of a bit of resealing going on in that aspect of not only God saying that it was good, but also I'm kind of wondering if maybe that has something to do with it as well. But also this thing of like, well, the work is also kind of done, and then now that you've kind of done the separation, you don't need the tinier one in this way anymore. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking about that a little bit.
The sealing is directly related to the way this is phrased is asymmetrical. There's no opening for the sealing to take place, but the opening is implied, right? Right, there's a taking, and so the image that's usually associated with this historically is a hand going into the side of a person, right? And then extracting something, whether it be a rib or an organ. I've seen both. And then the sealing is a reconsecration, for example, right? It could be thought of that way, or it could be thought of as a full restoration of that which was compromised. And yeah, the way this is phrased, you don't get that sense. But actually, if you look at the imagery, for example, without even knowing the story, which is actually how I got exposed to it, it's quite clear what's going on. There's a violation of the sanctity of the side of Adam. And from that violation, there's a wound. And that wound needs to be healed or fixed or restored. Otherwise, there's a problem. And
So,
yeah, I mean, Mitchell, the problem is we don't know if it's a bone, right? I've seen it bone or organ actually depicted. When I don't know what to make of that because I haven't read the book, but I hear the source material is great.
So I picked out the bone thing, right? Because we'll get into it. The bone is like the space, right? Like it's the organization. It's the thing that it's the space creation of Adam, right? So if you take away the space creation of Adam, put it separate, then you leave a void, and like in the King James it says, and then closed up the place with flesh, right? So there's a replacement, right? But it's not a place of structure, right? So in some sense, Adam becomes more malleable. Let's just say it in that sense, right? Like he's less dense, and and um and yeah. So and this bone, right? Like it would be like be the space around which Eve can be created then as well, right? So that's that's why I like the bone aspect, because it fits in the narrative here. But
Oh.
I think different analogies also work if you're trying to make a different point. Like that's kind of where, yeah.
Right.
So
We have to keep in mind it's not supposed to be a scientific, accurate, precise vision of some physical event. Like it doesn't matter if it's a bone or an organ. It doesn't matter if the flesh was sealed or how. It doesn't matter if it was replaced with flesh or an organ was regrown. Like none of this makes any difference, right? Because it's the symbolic abstraction layer that matters here. And so kvetzing over translations is pointless exercise based in some bizarre concept that somehow that would matter. But the point of symbolic representation is that the details can matter, but almost never do, right? Because you're highlighting principles and relationships and not objects, if objects are even real. Different discussion. So that's the important thing to remember, is not to get caught up in the fundamentalist interpretation of words idea, because it's not, that misses the point. That the physical realities will say of what parts is completely irrelevant and will take you away from the pattern. Because once you realize the parts don't matter, organ or bone, closed or not, or how it's closed, is like those details are irrelevant, right? The pattern remains without them because they can be swapped. Then you get the flavor of the book. Like this is what the book's trying to point out, is that the details at some layer, the details are irrelevant.
So I'm thinking, there's something interesting that I was thinking about some of the previous chapters that we had. And we talked about like alternating circles and squares as a sort of concept, which was funny because I hadn't actually looked at this page in days, and I thought that, and then I looked at this and I was like, oh, look at that, alternating circles and squares. But there is that kind of thing of like, opening the space and then completing the space at a higher scale and that sort of thing. So there is also, I was thinking about like the turning a situation that's bad into a higher good or something. And it's just like, oh no, I fell asleep and now my rib is open. It's like, not that you would even realize that, but also, wow, I just got married. It's like, you don't even, there's all these sorts of things that are happening there. But just kind of thinking of that aspect of the strange good, where it's like, okay, there's a loss of control and also like a physical loss that's happening there, that like, Adam wasn't asked beforehand. And then God is like, okay, like I'm going to do this because I know like he's going to love this. Like this, it's just like, don't even worry about it. It's going to be fantastic. And I think about this in my own life, where there's lots of things that have like been absolutely horrific. And then it's just like, oh, would I do that again if I knew like, oh, if you do this, like if you get this, and this is 100%. And like, I've even kind of resolved where it's just like, oh, if there's something cool that like I just have to just suffer in the moment, then it's just like, actually, yes, I consent. Like just, all right. Just do that because you don't know.
Castle, all you've proven to me is that God was never married. That was that whole rant just proved.
So another thing that it reminds me of is anesthesia, right? So you get put under, and that's like necessary in order to move things around that couldn't be moved around if you'd be awake. So there's an allowance. You could say it's a disablement of instinct or whatever. Where like maybe there's things that you can't bear to see, right? Or you can't bear just to experience, and they still need to occur. So like that's why you forcibly get put asleep.
I'm also thinking of the sort of thing of like, my power is perfected in weakness. And I think I mentioned this like a while back, this thing of like Wyke in weakness is related to flexibility. And so there is this sort of thing of, or maybe I did this on the Moby Dick thing. I think we were talking about like whale foreheads or something like that, cleaving boats. But this thing of, you have the extra little bit of flexibility so you're not brittle. And like that extra little bit allows for added durability. But thinking about this thing of, the equally yoked couple, where it's even like you can't get much more equally yoked than bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, but that thing of like, here is, if you think of a yoke, it's like you're yoking together two powerful animals that are supposed to be like doing a job. And so there is an aspect of, okay, now there is a complete loss of control that's happening. And then there's kind of a repair or repairing that's happening between these two. And then at that point, then they're sent off to go and work the garden. And it's like there is something that's kind of taking place there that shows, oh, there is that sort of third thing coming about as well.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think also like the separating, the river, organ, whatever from Adam, that kind of is like the first day of creation, 2 days of creation, whatever, where God separates the waters from the waters and puts the firmament in there. You've got, a bit of Adam separated from Adam, then you create the, space in between, which would basically be the marriage between Adam and Eve there. It's the firmament or whatever. So I think that maps on.
And like a way I also see it is if you join up with someone, right, they're an extension of you, right? So there's something of you in them, but they're not you, right? Because like they have their own will and all that stuff, right? So, but you still rely on them, and so there's a negotiation that's happening there, right? And it only works if like, to go back to the bone, right? Like if the structure, right, gets internalized in the other, right? So they need to assume the authority that you convey as the head, because if they don't internalize that authority, then they can't cooperate, right? Which means like to be as one body, right? Like corpus is body. So yeah, so there's something there about that, right? Where and that also goes into vulnerability. And when I hear weakness, I also think about metal, right? So metal has like a molecular structure that gives it its strength, but if you bend it a lot, you break the connections, right, and it becomes weak, right? So it loses its ability to hold things, and it will just bend. So what is that in a chemical structure, right? Like in the chemical structure, that means that the order, right, or the layers are no longer organized in such a manner that there's integrity, right? So there's interconnectedness between the layers, and so the integrity is lost, and as a consequence of the loss of integrity, weakness sets in. So
isn't that where you look at things like alloys and stuff like that, or there's like this small amount of like other metals that are put in to actually increase the flexibility of something like steel? There's this kind of like a touch of the foreign to provide flexibility
or strength, right? Like either is the case, depending on what you put in and how much. So when we go to the pictogram, the associations I got there is that the dreaming is like related to the unattainable, and Castle also kind of mentioned this already. It's like there's an interrupted mediation, right? So I was actually talking about it this week, where when you dream, your sense of agency is different, right? Because you can kind of participate in the dream, but you're not in full control like you would be when you're awake, right? And so like the control's kind of reduced to saying yes and no. Like I'm going to cooperate or I'm not going to cooperate, but you don't really get say in how it unfolds. And like there's also dreams where you even lose that capacity, right? And you're just a spectator. You just goes along and you're not even aware that you could do something. But to bring a picture to that, right? Like I see it as trying to work a tool with a blanket in between or something, right? So the grip that you're having, right, is removed, right? Like you don't have a direct grip on your participation, right? Like the grip is mediated by something that you don't have sight on.
Yeah, I don't really have a solution for it. I guess I was just kind of reflecting on something that happened this week. There was a thing where, like, I was seeing that the lines were getting blurred for me, at least on one particular day, where I was like I was waking up from a dream where I was essentially having an argument with someone, and it was like an actually well articulated, set of argumentation, and it wasn't like an angry one either. Like, it was a pretty interesting dynamic situation, and I realized partway through it that I was actually, I think I like woke up to the fact that I was gesturing in my sleep, like in this conversation and doing that. And then I realized that I was awake. It snapped to me that I was awake. And then it took me about an hour to actually get up. It was like being in tar. And so there was this weird thing of like the lines were very blurred where all of my ability to articulate was actually present within the dream. And then when I had to do stuff that actually did involve words over that next hour right after waking up, that ability was completely compromised. And yet I could remember all the stuff that was going on in the conversation before. I don't have an answer for that, but that was a strange thing to happen to me this week.
Well, one of the aspects of dreams, it's not well talked about. Peterson sort of points in this direction, right? We're dreaming to test things out so that, he says our ideas die so we don't have to. No, pay attention to your dreams. You're often a third-party observer of yourself getting squished in some cases or succeeding in others. It's not 100% or anything. That happens quite often in dreams. And people forget that. So dreams is the closest place you come to what people wrongly and in the most evil fashion refer to as self-awareness or self-consciousness. That's where you have a perspective of yourself that's not from your own eyes out to the world. And that happens in your dreams. And I think, Castle, actually what you're experiencing there is the inability to switch back. It's like my perspective switched back into me. It's all over the place, right? Because it kind of spreads out in your dreams. And what Matthieu points to in the book, right, is this loose mediation between mind and body in particular. But I would argue that what actually happens is the less pushback you have from reality in general or from the world outside yourself that is not created by another person, right? And so we'll just call that the natural world. The less able you are to, the more in a dream state the more in a dream state you are, right? And the less able you are to understand where lines exist, right? Lines of like, you can't do that. And that's, people often confuse this for immediate pushback. It's not just immediate pushback, right? So if you've ever chopped wood, you can chop wood for too long, or pick up a maul that's too heavy for you, right? And in the moment, it all works out just bloody well. And 2 hours later, you realize you made a mistake. Right? Now, that can happen in your dreams. You can project that, but when you're not well connected to the world, you miss those facts of like, oh yeah, I can overdo this, and I won't know in the moment. I mean, they talk about this with diets all the time, right? Like, you don't feel full when you're full. You feel full 20 minutes later or something, or whatever. They throw up all these wacky numbers they have no way to measure and lie to us that they know, right? But it's true. Like, and I'm my big sin is gluttony. Like any form of gluttony that's all me. That's what I battle with constantly, right? I mean, I've destroyed the Jordan almonds already. I got them yesterday. Just it's it's been stressful. I had a rough week. I had an infection. It was not good. I was in the hospital. Leave me alone. So I'll die with Jordan almonds in my coffin. Thank you. Yeah, but I have to like I was eating lunch and I was like I have to plan out my food because if I put lots of food in front of me, it will all be gone before I stop eating for sure. That's not uncommon for me. So I know this about myself. It's every day, multiple times a day. This is what I'm fighting, right? So when you're in your dreams, because you lose sense of time, for one thing, partially to help you with that, ironically enough, right? Because when you compress time, you can see way forward in the future without waiting a year, right? Because your dreams can just fast forward you a year and all the interim things seem to happen somehow. It's very mysterious. When you have a dream about something in the future, it very often seems to include all the interim steps that you must have skipped because time, but time doesn't work the same when you're asleep at all. And I don't know how that works. I have no idea. I know that it happens. It's in the literature. If you read enough of the white papers, you'll see it there. But that's that loose mediation. It's a loose mediation in time, and it's a loose mediation of perspective. And because those two are somewhat untethered, that's what's supposed to allow your bad ideas to die so that you don't have to, as Peterson says, allow an avatar of yourself to die so you don't make a stupid mistake. And you'll hear this a lot. It's weird too because it happens everywhere. I was actually rather shocked. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Tony Robbins. But he's one of these motivational speaker guys, very, very popular, very famous. He wrote about his first marriage and how the night before he was getting married, he knew it was a mistake and he did it anyway. And it's like in a dream sort of a thing. It doesn't even matter how disciplined you are or how motivationally speaker you are, or any of that. Like your dreams will point to reality for you pretty reliably if you let them. Right. But they're not 100% reliable either. So, they can, your fears can run away with you and then you just get paranoid. That happens to a lot of people, actually. They just get paranoid. We see a lot of paranoia right now. We don't recognize it as such because they're blaming the government or the capitalism space dragon or whatever. But that's just forms of paranoia, right? Conspiracies are just all forms of paranoia. You could argue they're mild, but I don't actually think they are. I think you're misestimating the depth of the problem. But that it's that loose mediation and the nature of it that pretty much, as far as I can tell, almost nobody talks about, which is why I wanted to mention it here. But the tight mediation is important because what that implies is that in order to get anything done, the thing that we're very wrongfully calling tyranny now is required. It's not an optional feature of the universe. You want to get a building built, you need some tyranny. I don't think tyranny is the right word. It's just a word everyone seems to be using because we're all stupid with language for some reason all of a sudden. So that's important to notice because these two are that they're not in tension, they're in cooperation with one another, right? And they do that through the cyclicality of sleeping and waking. And once you connect these two through cyclicality, like with a figure 8, for example, would be a good way to connect these two diagrams, in my opinion. That resolves a bunch of stuff in my mind about how this is actually working. So I hope people find some assistance with that.
So I want to go to the working side, right? So the working side is like a system. Like I like to use the word constellation, right? So there's things in your mind or whatever that come together in order to fulfill a function, right? Like the eye on the top is the functionality or the principle that gives the functionality, and then you get intelligibility, right? You can work out a space, right? Like in science, you can do research within that space, right? There's all of these things, and what happens is well, because we need to do it, right? Because it's our job, it's our hobby, or whatever, right? Like we create these functionalities in us, right? And then Castle had this thing, this functionality of speaking, right? And we can stand in relationship to that functionality, right? In other sense, we can lose control over them, and so we can get carried away in between them. And I want to bring in this point of Joseph that, like, is paranoia a sin? Like, I think paranoia is actually you adhere to something that gives intelligibility, and you just keep holding on to it. And against better judgment, or against things that draw you away from that perspective, you keep holding on to the perspective because you have an emotional connection to that, or right, you just don't have the strength, which also might be the case. um, and then that starts living a life of its own, right? Just like my headache, right? Like, if it's too oppressive to me, it starts living a life of its own, right? And it starts taking control over me. And so, like, you can get possessed, right? And so you need to loosen, you need to weaken your attachment to these things to reestablish a new relationship, right? And I think when you do prayer or meditation or whatever, right? Like, what you're really doing is you're trying to get to a perspective where you're not caught in a perspective, right? Like, you or you maybe perspective isn't the right word, a way of being, and that way of being isn't captured by perspectives, right? And so what that allows you to do is it allows you to gain a new relationship, start a new way of functionality, right? A new principle. You can adhere to a new principle that allows you to establish a healthy relationship instead of the corrupted relationship that you're under, right? And so the thing that I'm experiencing in church is like the singing and the chanting, the repetition, all of these things, they draw you out, right? And then, like, I got this thing of a lullaby, right? So you can get drawn into things, but you can also get drawn out of things, right? And like, I think music is a really strong way to do that, right? Because there's like a lot of participation, especially if you're dancing and singing along, right? So there's like all your systems now align with the music, right? Like, you're attending completely, and that allows you to loosen the things that you were holding on to, right? Like the worry or the threat, right? Like whatever the thing is that is dominating your attention, and like it allows, well, the godly or the divine perspective to take over and reestablish the right order.
Yeah, and I think part of proper mediation is understanding something very important, whether it's paranoia or conspiracy, or a lot of what you see now is, it's not a conspiracy. It was true. All true things are conspiracies, and all conspiracies are true. That's part of the problem. The Because the issue is not whether or not it's an accurate, precise representation of what's going on. The issue is whether or not it's something you can do something about. And if you can't do anything about it, the truth of the thing is irrelevant. Like, truth is not some higher order magical formula for changing the world. Like, even if you know the truth, who cares? Like, the truth was always there. So it wasn't relevant when you didn't know it, and it may not be relevant when you do know it. And that's the problem. And just because you are exposed to the truth doesn't mean you'll change. And just because you expose other people to the truth doesn't mean they'll change. This is a very weak and unimpressive and unimportant tool in the world at the end of the day. And no one wants to hear that. I fully understand we're living in the age of gnosis, but it's not helpful. So what you want to focus on are things you have control over, and what you don't want to focus on are things you have no control over or less control over. And that doesn't mean you put all of your attention on the thing you have the most control over. It means you dole your attention out according to how much control you can have, right? And so you should pay attention to politics approximately 2 days before you have to vote, and at no other time, right? And you shouldn't spend a lot of time in those 2 days thinking about politics either, because more information won't help. It'll just make you more confused, and that'll make it harder for you to vote. But that's all you can do with politics for most people is vote, and like that doesn't take a lot of time, so you shouldn't focus a lot of time on it. Certainly shouldn't be looking at an election a year in advance. Like that there's so many things that are going to change that will affect your vote, that they're actually important, and that's the problem. We get caught up in the more information before we act, instead of acting on the things we can act on today. It's a great distraction. It's the old help the poor people in Africa before you help the homeless man on your way to work problem. It's the same formulation. But being awake is all about that, because helping the guy in Africa when you're never going to go to Africa, that's not great. If you're going to go to Africa, that's different. But if you're not going there, you're dreaming. That's a dream. That's a dream that you can help people in Africa from not Africa, and you can't. Maybe you can pay somebody else to do that, or maybe they'll run away with your money. I have no idea. Or maybe they're wrong, and what they're doing is making it worse, because all of that has happened with Africa in particular. It's a big place, lots of countries. But like this is why that's a dream. And this is why helping the homeless person in front of you, and maybe you don't give them money because that might be bad, that's important. And it's super significant. Dreams are not real, by the way, Joseph. Sorry. His thoughts are not real. You can't verify them. So nope, not real.
So about the voting thing, right? Like you don't get to do much in the voting, right? You can just like do the check mark. Like there's nothing beyond that you can do, right? So you have to realize that that's your responsibility to do the check mark and nothing else, right? And so like this extreme detailed understanding of anything in politics is actually irrelevant for for the voting, because that's usually not what you're voting on. And even if you do, right, like they always promise a lot of things and then they don't happen. So it's like that's also sometimes because they can't happen, and sometimes because they just assholes that are lying. So yes, so that goes back to the bottom part. Hierarchical mediation requires clear communication between the mind and the body, right? So that's also true for politics, right? Like if you're the head of the state, like the only way that you can affect things is by having a clear communication. And if you have like a wickedly complex bureaucracy, then that's like, kind of like a blanket that's covering your agency, and you're like in a dreamlike state, and you're pretending that you can rule the country or lead the country while you actually can't, because like it's not possible. Going to the next page. So yeah, here's they're talking about the dream world. So what I had is the dream world is not related to external input. So it's a world that doesn't have to have accountability towards reality. And it's in some sense it's like a safe space, or a clean room maybe is a better word, where you can well, you can certain rules don't apply, and that's how you can test things, right? And that's also a way that you can find out that rules that you have in your head might not be real, because you can find out a scenario that's functional without the rule that you deem is part of reality. So I think that's really important, right? So like uh, it's loosening up structures or fixations. Maybe that's a better word. Fixations that you have in your being that were false, right? Like they were assumptions that weren't justified.
So I'm thinking a little bit about the sort of hierarchical mediation of like specifically the lower, like the base of the structure being kind of taken out. So last week we kind of had this thing of, the diagrams that seem to be either a person losing their legs or losing their shoes or something like that, and then kind of the way that the structure winds up kind of collapsing as a result of that. But then also this kind of this like transitional or maybe damaged or mediation that's in need of some sort of repair happening. I was thinking about on the previous page, he talks about the hierarchy of this, but then on this one, kind of talking about Adam's head being standing as the top of a pillar, and then he's got his feet as his supports. And then you go from the standing up to the lying down. And I was just kind of thinking of this with respect to the sort of taking Eve out of Adam's side. So, people talk about a person that, they fall in love with somebody, right? Like there's a sort of falling that is taking place there. There's a lack of mediation kind of involved. They didn't just decide like, yes, I'm going to do this right now at this exact time of the day or something like that. And that one of the words that people kind of use is or phrases they use is what is it, head over heels or something like that. And there is this kind of thing of like, oh, there's a flipping going on, but also like a loss of the lower supports have been taken out. And then that is not necessarily destructive. It could be. It's a very uncertain sort of thing, and maybe it often is destructive, but that kind of requires that mediation after the fact.
So I want to pick up on this. So if I dream about a monster, am I in danger? And the answer to that is a monster is something that's on the edge of intelligibility, according to Jonathan Pageau, right? So monsters are mediations between the unknown and the known, or things that come from the unknown into the known, and they're not always bad. Like they're a monster because you don't know how to deal with them. You don't know how to classify them, and the danger is in your perception, right? Because like there is a dangerous component in the thing that you don't have a classification for, right? Because you don't have a way to relate to it. But that doesn't mean that you're in danger, right? Because like literally God himself could appear to you and have that same form because you not you don't have the ability to discern what the form is because you don't understand. So the perception of danger doesn't mean that you're really in danger, right? And this is the problem with dreams, right? They're not real. Like they could be real. They're your perception, right? Or they're not even your perception. They're part of your perception. They're a manifestation of your perception of the situation that you're in, right? But but you usually don't have a coherent perspective, right? You don't have a coherent relationship to anything in the world because there's multiple stances that you could take to something that just would change the nature of what you're dealing with, right? So like if if a mouse comes at you, right, and you perceive it as a threat, then you are gonna run away from it. Like or whatever, or you're gonna pick up a sword and fight it, or a gun and shoot it, right? If you if you see a mouse and you're like, okay, like this is just a part of nature, right? Like it's gonna be insignificant, right? There's many ways in which the one appearance can affect you, right? So also, like, you could have a clean house, right? And now there's a mouse there, and it's like, oh, like the sanctity of my house has been violated, right? So then the threat of the mouse isn't in the mouse itself, but in the fact that it somehow came to house in your house, right? And so now you need to account for the pest, right? Like the infestation uh, that you're dealing with. So like even if you are in danger, right? Because like a pest is a danger, or at least a potential danger. It like it doesn't tell you the size of the danger, the way that you have to relate to it. Like it doesn't say anything about these things, and yeah, like and it doesn't say anything about whether it's true or not.
But I just want to add something to the sort of monster bit, because there was a request to kind of expound just a bit on that sort of difference of, oh, is this thing a monster? Is it not? And I was thinking of like the Bengal tiger. That you take one of those and if it's in a zoo and it's in a completely enclosed area, the thing was raised in that environment. You've got, kids coming up to see it up against, the giant thick glass, and they're buying, stuffed animals or whatever. Like, that's not a monster. Like, it's an animal. It's potentially dangerous, but this is a thing that's under observation and all these things. And there's people caring for it. Like, the thing basically lives, just eating out of the hand of, people wearing cargo shorts. Like, that's pretty much what its life is. Whereas you take, 150 years ago, and you have or even, I mean, gosh, probably just within like the last few decades, you take some village in India where there's a native Bengal tiger, and this thing just shows up to your town while you're, trying to wash your clothes. Like, yes, that's a monster. Like, you just see orange stripes behind the trees or something like that. 1000% that's a monster. But it is very much related to the discernment and the mediation and your ability to interact with this specific thing. And so it's like, ultimately, like, God made that thing. In a non-fallen world, it's not an issue. In a fallen world, it has the potential to be an issue or not, depending on how you engage with it and your capacity to do so. But and then the thing with the kind of like monsters and dreams sorts of thing, it's like you lack information at that point. I mean, like, you might wake up from a nightmare and maybe that was your physical senses letting you know that you need to respond to like a home invasion or something like that. Or maybe you just watched, a scary movie or something like that, or you have other stuff on your mind. It is an incomplete data set to be making actions on.
So I had an experience or an insight in church today, right? And it's about forgive and forget. I was like, because people say, well, let's just forgive and forget. I was like, that's wrong. Because if you forget, like what it means, you put the monster, right, which is this transgression, you put it in a cage, right? You just like, okay, we'll just lock it away, and we throw away the key, right? But the proper way to deal with it is to give that transgression a place, right? Like it like it happened. Like, there's no use in denying that it happened, and the reason that you forgive is that you can come back together with the acknowledgement that it happened, right? And like it becomes part of the relationship. Like you build upon it. You don't forget it. It's like, no, like that something went wrong between us, and we need to work on this, like all of that stuff, right? Like, if you're just forgetting it, you're putting it in a cage, and like it stays outside. It doesn't get to participate. It's just uh, it's just looming there, and like when it breaks free, because like there's no reason why it can't break free, like it's gonna bite you in the ass, right? Because like you think it's safe, right? Like you think you've resolved it, but you haven't, because you're in denial. Like the forgetting things, like things occur. Like there's no reason to forget them. The only reason that you would forget something is that you're offended by its existence. And like it is in existence, right? And like if you deny things that are, right, or that have happened, that are real, and so to talk about a non-animal monster, right? It's like, okay, so someone transgressed against me. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means for our relationship. Like, so then my response is forgiveness, right? Which is opening the door for restoration, right? Like I want to revivify that relationship that has been broken, right, by the transgression, and we we have to overcome this breakage in the bond in order to have the relationship again, right? And like that's a monster, right? Like, because that might actually be really hard, especially if betrayal was in the picture, right? And like if you've been betrayed and you're just like, okay, let's forgive and forget, is like, well, that's not smart, because like the thing that caused the betrayal is not gone, like it's still there, and so like that relationship is not restored. So like you need to restore the relationship in order to go further. Like there's and if it's not restored, like you shouldn't go further, because like that betrayal is still real. So
okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, like that's a monster, right? Like you betrayal happened, and now you're gonna have to figure out what that means. That's a monster.
So I'm thinking a little bit about this. Well, for one thing, and I guess this kind of goes into like the forgiveness thing, that in my estimation, so I just want to quickly, I guess for the folks at home, kind of differentiate reconciliation and forgiveness. So there is an aspect of forgiveness that's kind of like, okay, well, this thing's not going to, or this person's not going to be able to repay the fact that they, ran over the flowers in front of my house or something like that. Like they can't unrun over them or something like that. But also it's like, it's not necessary to, per se reconcile with that person, and like maybe it's a good thing in certain aspects, but it's like it's not necessary to then go and say, oh, now we're going to pursue a relationship after they did this, they broke into my car, let's be friends. It's like that would be a lot more. But also this sort of thing of there is a sort of a remembering or a reattachment to like I actually did have my car broken into many years ago. And that was something that is just like, well, I could still be mad at that guy. Like, we're not going to be BFFs or anything like that. I could stay mad at him, but also it's just like, what is he going to do? Unbreak my car window? It's like, you didn't really take anything of value. It was just some kind of paperwork, actually, it was just so pointless and stupid. But it's just like, whatever, like the thing was done. Like, I no longer want him to pay me back. I did for like a long time. I have no idea who it was, but it's just like, well, whatever. Like, I meet that guy eschatologically, and it's just like, I'm not going to beat him up. Like, all right, we're okay. But I'm thinking also this thing of the monster thing. So we talked several sessions back about like not accounting for the snake in the garden. Like, you have the responsibility, like the ability to respond to this, strange thing. What is this, that just has started talking to me? And like, you can respond to it, but ultimately it requires a looking up. So in the case of the Bengal tiger or something like that, is that the solution to the Bengal tiger for the village in India is not to create a zoo, right? Like, you just, but if you go and you're aiming up, like you develop, a city or something like that, like by kind of seeking first the kingdom, you wind up essentially subsuming that tiger as an ornament, that, and until it's that, like, you're not supposed to actually account for it. If it's stopping you from being able to just like do your laundry, or if it's attacking your kids during lunchtime or something like that, like you just kill the thing and you just take responsibility and get the thing done. But it eventually does have a place if you do actually have a large enough structure. So that is a thing. But also with this looking up, like if these guys in the comments are actually enduring some sort of, like diabolic torment or something like that, the seeking first the kingdom and looking up, and in this case, setting up a framework or a robust prayer regimen in your day, is actually, if you're lacking a sort of scaffolding and the if the lines are getting blurred, as they were, like, this past week, I during the week of Thanksgiving and a little bit before that, I took some time off, which I never do. I actually almost never, I racked up like over 200 hours of PTO time or something like that because I just don't take off time. And I finally did, and I actually was at rest long enough that I think my body started shutting down and I got sick. I hadn't been sick in like 2 or 3 years or something like that, like at all. Being around sick people all the time, and like I just never get it. But then I start taking a rest, and eventually my whole body just shuts down, and I'm more or less back up on that. But I was like, oh, this is interesting. I start getting sick, and then the weird dream stuff starts happening, and even realizing now, like, my thought patterns during the day were very odd, but then I had very, very clear dreams and all these things. And it's like, oh yeah, the lines got very blurred, but it was that I was actually very used to a certain amount of structure. And then I got rid of that. I wasn't actually mediating well between, okay, enough rest and enough work. I just went full tilt into the one. And then now we've got an extreme pendulum swing that I'm trying to kind of get to stop swinging. And it's more or less resolved now. But I was like, man, that was like a week about, of just everything got completely put into disarray. And so it is necessary to, without overworking yourself or like overextending into space, being able to go and actually mediate, like there's a medium aspect of mediation where you're not supposed to overdo stuff. And I don't know what saint it was. I wouldn't be surprised if it was St. John Chrysostom. It probably was. That said, let the best response to a fierce attack is not a fierce defense, but moderation. And that there is that thing of like, you're not going to go and just full on go into like lock yourself down into security mode. You see these like very talented martial artists, and a lot of times like their attacks are also their blocks, and they're doing it easily when they're not out of breath. And it's just like, that is a guy who, they went through the structure. They did all the practice and everything like that, and had the discipline over much time, but their mediation is moderate. They're not, there is no need for all the yelling and the craziness and like, overextending or any of that stuff.
Yeah, that's literal mediation, right? So commonly, I think it's jujitsu, right? You use the attacker's force against them, right? They come after you, you step aside. Stepping aside, much less energy than thrusting forward, right? Uses the principle that defense is easier than offense, right? Uses less energy. Absolutely true. Deflection is the way to meet force. So I know this from experience. If someone's throwing rocks at you, the proper way to do it is to block them properly. And if you have proper blocking technique, which I did when I was young, not a problem. You won't even get bruised by blocking rocks thrown at you at high speed, by the way. I've done it more than one. That's quite a few, actually. And that's because you can mediate the force of the rock coming at you by meeting it with a much lesser force that deflects it. So to your point, I mean, this works in the physical world quite well. And actually, you know about that if you do martial arts. I mean, you learn this in a very visceral way. I was fortunate to do it when I was young. Right? Because that was also when I needed it. But once you know, I mean, it's a cliche in the martial arts world. Once you know how to fight, you no longer need to fight. True, that also happens. But and kids will be kids. That's why they were throwing rocks. I witness kids throwing rocks at other kids all the time. Still, I don't think that's changed. I don't think that's ever going to change. By the way, it's just children are children. I'm sure Christopher can tell you about children and throwing objects at people. Yeah, they just do that. I don't know why. It's fun for them, I guess. I don't know.
And actually, the same is true for catching a ball, right? You have to move with it and change its trajectory, else it will just bounce away. So, yeah, that was one monster that we tackled there. So,
could I make one last comment? Sorry, about the monster thing. I just want to mention the word demonstrate. That it's literally demonstrare, like it's actually the word for monster. It's to remove the monster. So when you exemplify, you're actually destroying a monster for other people that don't know how to do a thing. So I just want to kind of mention that as well, that by actually doing stuff in the world and making demonstrations, you actually wind up removing the number of monsters. And materialistically speaking, you could say you're reducing the entropy in your environment.
Does anybody want to talk about pictograms?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, this is that compression I was talking about with the fractal nature of reality, right? Where you see it's really the same image twice, but one's smaller than the other, right? And then one's referring to one layer of reality down from the outer one, right? And that's all that is. And I thought that was actually a really clever way to do it. If you jumped into this at this point in the book, it wouldn't make any sense. Fair enough. But when you get the sequence and then you get this, it's like, oh, there's, and he's done this before. Maybe you didn't notice. It's fine, right? This is a different way of showing practicality, right? It's a different way of showing the fractal nature of reality. I like this way the best. Just personally, just personal preference, has nothing to do with anything important. Because this is sort of how I see things, we'll say. Like I would see things stacked and layered on top of one another in the world. So for me, the way my brain works, it just makes it easier visually because I'm a visual processor to see the patterns very, very quickly because I just overlay them. And it's like, oh, and that's actually why I can tell you things are wrong instantly. It takes a lot longer to validate them as correct, but it's really easy to see wrong things when you overlay the patterns because they're right out of pattern by scale, and you can go, oh, right. And there's different ways to deal with that, but I find this particular way of doing this very helpful. And again, I think if RJ were here, he would tell us pay close attention to the arrows because you'll miss them because it's a busy diagram at the end of the day. But once you kind of get, oh, the arrows actually mean something and they're representing something important within the diagram, and it's not the arrows represent not just motion, but also starting and ending points. And once you understand, because you have to in a diagram at the end of the day, arrows always have to play a double role. But once you understand that starting and ending point as well as motion point, that should open things up for you a little bit more. Yes, there's no starting and ending point in the circle. That's the nature of the circle. That is correct. Also significant, though. That's what I would say there.
Yeah, so I want to point out the arrows. So we were talking about interconnectedness between the layers, and I think it goes into it later, but I don't remember where, right? But I think this is a good point to point it out. So working the land, right? So like think of a growing cotton, right? So when you grow cotton, you can dress the body, right? Or mining iron, right? Like when you mine iron, you can build a harness, right? Like all of these things, they allow you, they participate in the dressing, and so they're not unconnected, and so they're a literal extension of your body, right? And so now you can see the specialization that you're doing around your body, right? Because it's not only physical clothes, right? Like it might also be skills, right? Like they're also addressing of your personal body. They're dependent upon the resources that are available, right? And so that interconnection, that specialization, all of these things, they're in service to a, a certain principle or certain need, right? So you can see the top on the pyramid, right? That is informing like the direction, and this is like basically talking about the means of adhering, or the ability to adhere. And so it in the lines below, it starts talking about daily rituals of dressing for work, right? Or like they even had dressing for dinner, right? Or dressing for a date. So there's all of these dressing up, right? Putting on your face. They're all sorts of. Well, you can even put on your work clothing as protection, right? Like that's also a dressing up that you do. And they, apart from that, they're needed in some sense because they have a functional role. They're also spiritually fulfilling a role in transitioning between identities or relationships, right? And like this is one of the problems that we're experiencing now, right? Like if I just leave this book club and log into Discord, I didn't change anything, right? Like the most you could say that I dressed or undressed is like push two buttons and changed the layout on my screen. Like that's as far as but there's no ritual around it, right? Like I don't have to pull things over my head. I don't have a different weight of the clothing. I don't have a different sense of being in relationship. Well, like maybe a little bit, right? But all of these things they're missing, right? And so um, these dressings, just like think of a cop putting on the belt with weapons or whatever, right? the when the cop is armed in its role, now the agency also completely changes, right? Like now you're walking around with a gun that you can point at people, right? You have your book where you can write fines in or whatever, right? Like you are an extension of the law. Um, so the whole world, the way that you see the world, the way that you get to participate in the world, all changes as a consequence of dressing up. And to go to the other side of the coin, the undressing, because that's also a thing that we forget. We do a ritual to undress after this book club, which is called integration, right? So there's a way of giving things a place, right? So like the cop coming back at the office needs to do paperwork. That's a way to undress, right? Like it's also a way to leave things at work, so you don't take them to your home. It's a way to close things, to free yourself of the burden, right? Like literally lifting in the burden that's dressing you, right? Like it's holding you down. Um, and yeah, I think it's important to realize that all of these things have a functionality, and that we get to participate in them.
So I'm thinking a little bit about this line just before the diagrams there, because it is something that we've gone over a little bit before, and we're kind of getting in better detail now. So even though consciousness turns aimlessly on itself during sleep, that level of existence plays an important role of renewal and recreation. So I was thinking a little bit of this aspect of kind of, I used the example a while back of that movie, the Groundhog Day. And I kind of made an analogy there that Bill Murray's character is a lot like like a sweater in a wash cycle and a washing machine, and then also like a drying cycle, and that you can kind of go through that movie and kind of see like the different cycles that he's in. And there is this sort of aspect also of kind of needing to, like, say if you actually do have a jacket or a sweater or something like that you need to wash. Maybe that's the one thing, just for this example. Like there is a necessity to, in order to renew it, there is a necessity to undress from that. Like say maybe you just own the one jacket and you go to a coin laundry or something like that and need to wash this really quick. You have to actually remove it. You need to relinquish or let go of that part of yourself, and then kind of let that go. Then through the process, it's going to get even worse for a little while there as well. So it's like, it's even less wearable, whatever condition it was in, after you put it into the washing machine and started it. And then there is a necessity to kind of let the entire process go all the way through, and maybe even kind of like your ability to mediate within that process is a whole lot less. But I'm just kind of thinking a little bit about this, like the need for sleep, the need to actually have those kind of dreams, the need to actually be renewed in this sort of way, and that it is also kind of, I would say, important to not go and seek after trying to have control. Like, people sometimes will go and they try to make it like a daily practice, even to completely control their dreams and be super, super lucid. But there is a very much like an overextension going on there of trying to be, 100% involved in the washing process. So you can easily get yourself burned. You can get yourself hurt by trying to over intervene into renewal processes.
Yeah, and I want to point out, Castle, since you brought up the text, that something that people probably missed was just before that. While the workaday world is characterized by productive work, accumulation, and the construction of a permanent reality, the dream world is characterized by vanity and inconsequentiality because it is self-contained and self-referential, like a snake eating its own tail. Let's just reverse that. If somebody's saying self-transcendent, they're conveying a dream. It is not permanent. It cannot be made permanent, right? If they're using a self-reference, they're conveying a dream to you. You can't participate in their dream. You can participate in your version of their dream, but you're not in the workday anymore. You're not in the workaday. You're in the dream world. And so you can use that self-reference to spot people who are, there's a technical term called bullshit, who are bullshitting you. And you should use that. I mean, people come after me all the time. I'm like, no, dude, it's real easy, actually. Right? Self-transcendent. You're full of shit. Time to go. See you later. Bye. You're in the dream world. There cannot be a state of self-transcendence. It doesn't make any sense at all, and it cannot ever be made any sense of. Does that mean that when you thought of something and labeled it self-transcendent, you weren't thinking of something that isn't real? No, but your label's wrong because you don't understand something because it's a dream. There's nothing wrong with that, but trying to get other people to participate in it, there's something wrong with that, and they're going to do that. You can't stop them. But you can prevent yourself from getting trapped in that self-referential or self-contained system that they're putting out into the world. And it's not that hard to recognize, actually. And that's why I like this. I like that in particular, right? There's a couple of others like that in here. But they're super important because they give you very easy, quick ways to avoid people who are doing things that maybe with the best of intentions, that's how the road to hell is paved after all, people who are doing things that aren't good for you and probably for them either.
And I like the idea of washing, like Hassel said, right? So if you're in control of the washing, right? Like let's just say, like, are you gonna move everything like two steps to the right, and then you're gonna whack it a little bit. You're gonna do things to the left, right? Like you start losing sight of the purpose, and you're imposing the procedure, and you start referencing the procedure, right? Because now it's like, wow, like I should use it like 3 times to the left and whack it 5 times, right? And like you're no longer participating in the bigger picture, and you're also no longer serving the goal of cleaning. You're serving the goal of optimizing whatever you perceive as that which cleans, and that even goes like a lot more wacky if you include other people, right? Because like if you well, I know, whatever, like you're in a relationship, you get your wife to cook, and you start micromanaging your wife in the cooking, like now everything will go wrong, right? Your relationship will go wrong, the cooking won't get better, like all of it won't work, because that's not the level of agency that you should exert, even if you're right. like like it just doesn't work. It's losing sight of the principle that guides you, right? And it's reorganizing work in your personal dream, right? Because it's like we're trying to adhere to this personal standard, uh, and that's also making cooperation impossible.
I really like the bit about like interrupting someone while they're trying to cook. You know, it's so ridiculous, but I see this example actually too much. I mean, to see it once is too much, but I actually see this fairly often. And there is that sort of aspect of like, you know, and I've heard horrific things. Like there's a line that's been stuck in my head forever, probably. That I've heard multiple unique women actually say, "Oh, you know, my husband can't even boil water." And it's like that is actually horrifying that multiple unique human beings have actually said this to me, like just out of nowhere. But then you see the sort of thing of like, oh, you know, they're in the middle of making some huge, you know, meal for a holiday or something like that. And it's like, oh, well, can you do it like this? Or can you add this little thing? Or, oh, you know, can you make like a little separate thing of also this, you know, but it's like, yes, I see that you know, you're whipping the mashed potatoes, but can you actually have like a separate version where it's just actually mashed, you know, and it's all these extra things. And then it's like, you're actually impeding the entire process, even worse for another person. Like it's one thing if you do this to yourself, you know, but it's like you're adding all this other stuff, and then usually it's the same guys at the end who are like, "Oh, can you pass the salt?" It's like, dude, you were that involved, but also you couldn't even do that, you know. And I don't know, like that just reminds me so much of the trying to take over um, with the dream thing, but also that where it's like if you have access to you know, a new availability from whatever sort of new structure that you have. Say, you know, you got these nice appliances, you got nice stuff and everything, and then you decide like, well, I want it done so exactly to my liking that I'm just gonna go back to manually washing my clothes, you know, like actually with like a lathe or something like that, because it has to be done just right. And it's like, no, there's a certain level of like letting go that's also necessary.
So that's interesting because with coffee, that's like highly like like the precision that people like use with coffee or even brewing, like that's also a thing. It's like, oh, we gotta get that detail just right. And what I heard you talk about there is to give direction versus having a request, right? So if you direct, you're interfering in the manifestation. While if you make a request, right, you give the other the opportunity to fulfill it or not and choose their path in the fulfillment. So that's a important distinction there. Um, so I want to go to the bottom of the page. Uh, In the context of a macrocosm, externally falling asleep means gradually failing to mediate between heaven and earth, losing the support of the land, right? So like that's kind of kind of what we were talking about, right? If you start interceding, you also start losing the support. In practice, this means that the soil no longer raises matter into food, but begins to produce wild and often inedible vegetation, right? So that's the removal of the telos, right? So having something occur wildly means that it emerges and it's no longer participating, it's no longer embedded into this higher structure, right? And so like if you start giving too many directions, right, the adherence starts relating to the direction and no longer to the telos, right? So like if someone is cooking and I give 5 instructions, then they're just gonna like follow my instructions and they're no longer gonna be paying attention to how everything fits together, right? And then the putting things together will fail as a consequence, well, of cognitive overload, right? Like effectively, because there's only so many things that you can handle, right? And then you might also have the opposite, right? Like people don't wanna or they can't relate to the whole picture, and they're asking for direction, right? So they just They want to just have a sequence of procedures, and then they still end up failing, even though they executed the procedures correctly, because they don't have knowledge of what they're participating in. Like they don't have a right relationship. Okay, on the next page.
Oh, wait, could I add one thing? Actually, I was thinking about the thing of he talks about being undressed for sleep, but having a cosmic significance. But I just want to kind of give a contrast to that with what some significance might look like if you remained dressed while sleeping. And so if you're still completely dressed, like shoes and all, for sleep, either you're lazy or you might actually be like anticipating a threat or something. Like we kind of talked about, like the girdling and everything like that to try to compensate for a certain weakness. If you're, if you're actually, like no one's necessarily expecting like a home invasion situation or something like that. But let's say that you were, it's like, would you still, completely undress for bed, or would you have, combat boots on and be like, as ready as you possibly could? Or you think about people going out camping and stuff, and it's like, well, chances are, especially if the weather is a certain way, like you're still going to be dressed in a similar way to how you're going to be when you have to step out and start a fire or something like that. So I just wanted to kind of mention that aspect of there is a significance of one of the layers of scale is not properly at rest if you have to then girdle one of the lower layers. There's something like you're preparing for some sort of outside threat, and maybe it's, if it was identifiable and not, just like sort of an amorphous monster of some sort, and maybe that's just the cold to the point of like the non-animal monsters. If that's an issue, then it makes sense that you're trying to kind of anticipate something by kind of keeping your options open.
Yeah, I think the threat that a lot of people see is waking up and putting your clothes on.
Right,
The
but
transition.
this highlights the importance of that process. Like that's one of the things, it might be hard to see, but like there's an importance to doing that. And this goes right back to Peterson and clean your room, right? Like there's an importance to preparing for bed. There's an importance to being naked in bed or whatever. And there's an importance to getting dressed in the morning. And that's why just doing that, like a lot of people, they end up working at home, they do it wrong. They don't get dressed in the morning, right? Or they dress the way they would at night, and they mix things, and then they're terrible at their job and they get fired. I've seen that a lot because they don't know how to keep the spaces separate, right? And if you're going to work from home, you want your own office or your own office space anyway, where you're primarily working, and you don't want to mix that with TV or distractions or whatever. It makes a huge difference to your productivity. And also to your personal sanity, as it turns out. A lot of people, and I've seen this a lot of people work from home and they actually go insane. They lose their minds and they can no longer work and their home lives fall apart. This is not unusual. I don't want to say it's common, but it happens enough that I've seen it a lot. I've watched it happen over the years. And that's because you're not paying attention to that cyclicality. That's not optional. You can't flatten out the world in time and just stay dressed all the time so that you can hop out of bed to deal with wildlife castle. That's usually why my uncle did it. He would stay dressed sometimes. But it's not, you wouldn't do it all the time, right? Because it's not healthy.
I completely agree, and it is interesting because I realize there's a lot of artificial dressing in a sense, or a kind of artificial informing that is necessary for me because I do have basically the lifestyle that you just described as being extremely hazardous, and I do not have the necessary space to mediate in that way, so I am actually patching in different ways to try to compensate for that, and it is not a permanent solution, and I realize that like very well. But also, like, in order to sort of compensate for this sort of lack of being dressed in that way, there's needed other scales to kind of compensate for that, but it's still not an ideal sort of situation at all. So, and there's different types of being fully dressed when, you know, going asleep as well. Like you can kind of go up in abstraction as well, and you know, like way more than the material, the aspect of remaining dressed or structured, or having, you know, we talked about like the tent as kind of like an extension of the clothes sort of thing. So having those different layers as well.
So here at the top it says, in these circumstances, Adam is forced to wander from place to place, right? So that's the exile. So it's important to realize that now there's an imposition of force, right? And then consume whatever nature happens to provide, right? So now there's an emergence aspect and a dependence upon the emergence, right? So that's two compulsions. Like the wandering is a compulsion, and the things that you engage with are also a compulsion. And so if we contradict that with a structure, right, or a house, you get to choose the seeds that you plant. Therefore, you get to choose what you eat. So there's a buffering that you get to have, right? Like you also get reliable food, right? So you might not go a day without food because you have it stored or whatever, right? And then obviously if you have a house, like there's still the layer up, right? Like the cosmic scale events, like a storm or whatever, and you can just get wrecked anyway. But it's important to realize, right? Like these structured things, they give you freedom from the compulsive nature of things, right? So to go to Castle's example, right? Like he has to artificially build in these things, because if he doesn't, then he's kind of at the mercy of his whims. Let's just say it that way.
And it happens fast if you don't are actively working on it like daily. Yeah.
Okay, and then under the pictogram it says, according to the biblical cosmology, sleeping and dying involves falling into the earth, right? So that would be analogous to turning to dust, right? Like you're, and I think we'll get into it, regressing into a previous state, a previous relationship, right? Constituent parts, whatever way you wanna talk about it, right? You can also look at it as being exiled from your community, right? Like now you're going into the forest, right? Like you become from a city dweller, you become like a nomad effectively, right? So you're going back a stage in, well, what is it? Civilization, I guess. And it's interesting because like I did a Bible reading this week where they were talking about John the Baptist, right? Who was wild, like he was living in the wild. He was announcing from the wild, right? From the desert, from the external, the coming of Jesus, right? So there's an element where the desert, the place of the dead is also the place where renewal comes from, right? Where it also the stranger, right? Like the stranger is coming from there, and that might be someone who's gone into exile willingly or unwillingly, or it might actually be someone from the extremities, right? That has no relation.
And that's where you would meet the monster as well, right? To tie into the earlier conversation. So
Well,
they
they don't
remain
have to
as
be
well.
monsters though. Like that.
But if you do meet monsters, they would be there, right?
Yes, that's the place you go to meet monsters. Yes.
Well, monsters can be anywhere. That's the problem. Like you'll run into monsters all over the place. I mean, Christopher could be a monster. I don't think so, but he's got a kind face. But also could be a serial killer. I don't know. I mean, can happen. Castle's definitely a monster. Just know that already. I mean, you can meet monsters anywhere. I mean, that's why it's going into exile and wandering. It's the exile is the unknown. You don't know what you're going to meet there. Right? It could be all good stuff. Oh, right. Right. You go wandering and find a garden, and that's great. So I mean, monsters could be anywhere at any time, and that's why you need to be able to discern them from things that aren't monsters, because a lot of things are scary, right? And until you know what they are, they seem like monsters. To the earlier point, but maybe when you demystify them, they're not, right? And this is a problem. So, like, I heard, I think it was first Pendulette. I heard this from, but so Pendulette's a big guy. He's like 6'3" or 4 or something. He's just a big guy, and he explained. I saw him in person. He used to do these Sunday school specials, but he explained like it's not easy being a big guy because you have two choices. You can either be scary and assertive, or you can be basically a clown, right? You can appear harmless. Because you're large, right, or larger than average, we'll say, people automatically ascribe something to you about your level of danger. And so you need to either embrace that by saying, yeah, I'm big, and what are you going to do about it? Nothing, right? Or you need to play a role of appearing harmless. And I like that was one of the most insightful things I've ever heard, certainly from a magician. It was quite insightful. I was like, wow, I never thought it. And I was with my buddy, who's actually quite large. He's 6 foot something and just a big guy. Big, just a big guy. And he's like super, like, talk about a teddy bear. He is the nicest, smiliest, happiest person. And that's how he gets along, because if he wasn't like that, he'd be pretty scary. I'm not a big person, so like I'd be like, oh no, he can crush me easily, right? So that's actually really important to recognize, is that you have to be able to recognize monsters. Some things, when you know more about them, including things that don't appear to be monsters, like Christopher, become monsters. Like you can't, it goes both ways. Like sometimes you meet something that looks perfectly harmless, is a monster, right? And like you hear these stories all the time, and that's the problem. And different people have different levels of discernment, right? Some people can look at pictures in a lineup and tell you who the murderers are. This is a real measured phenomena that's statistically significant. And some people, for whatever reason, can't do that. I'm always like, I don't know how you looked at those eyes and you didn't see that's a bad person. And they can't. And like, fair enough, we all have different skills. But also, I know a bunch of people that can do that like I can. And I'm like, well, how come everybody can't do this? But they can't. So you don't know, the important part is to be able to discern the monster. Because it may not appear to be a monster at first, right? Or it may appear to be a monster at first, and then it just turns out it's just Castle, who's a little weird. So it all depends.
And also in the Bible, at a certain point, like God calls Jerusalem to be destroyed because Jerusalem itself has become the monster. So you can be the monster too. And what happens right after it's destroyed? The people are scattered, right? So everybody's being put into exile, right? And so like, why is the exile there? Now it's a restoration, right? So basically what it said is like the whole is so corrupted that it can't heal, and the only healing can occur in the atomization and the restructuring from scratch.
I was thinking about this a little bit, so I'm wondering, like, I 100% agree. I think it's also possible for like willing participation in that. And like it is explicitly said in the Bible, but the problem is people just repeatedly just don't do that. Like that's kind of it. Like it winds up being that, oh, did it have to be this way? And it's like, in a sense, yes, because people just weren't going to do the work, even after they get called out. I mean, you got like Nineveh and like basically no one else, where it's just like, that's the one thing where it's like, oh, even the cows are wearing sackcloth and ashes. It's like, okay, perfect. The one time it actually worked. Otherwise, and it's like, I forget which, it probably happened multiple times. Like God tells a prophet, like, look, tell them about all this horrific destruction that's for sure going to happen. Maybe they'll change their ways and it won't happen. Also, they're probably going to keep doing what they're going to do, and it's going to happen. Like, yes, this is the events have been set in motion in such a way that yes, this is going to happen, but also not necessarily if you actually do the thing. Like, it's, and that makes me think a little bit of the John the Baptist thing. So you have, Adam being exiled from the garden. Now he has to go and live off of the land, and this is a nightmarish sort of situation. But then you've got, John the Baptist, who is actually doing exactly the same thing and is doing fine, But the difference is that he's not looking down; he's looking up. That he's not thinking about, oh gosh, what are these things going to make for me, or any of those things. He's not sweating any of it. He's just doing his job, and then all the stuff that he needs is provided to him.
And I want to grab two things from that, Castle, because that was really good. One implication here is that free will is an option, right? Because God doesn't know. Will they turn it around or not? I don't know. If you don't exercise it, the way to revivify the city is you lose it. And then you refine yourself in the desert, and then you return to the city, right? So at some point, the corruption, if you want to phrase it this way, which I don't actually like, but people seem to do it, the corruption of the city seeps into the people. Then they have to get out of the city to refine in the desert, which is painful and sucky and totally not recommended, by the way. Don't let it get that far. That might be a hint for, we'll say, recent times. And then they get returned to the city, right? And so, right, but and there's still that aspect, though, before that of, can you turn it around? Are you going to do it? Because it takes work. And that's the message that's missing from absolutely everything. Like, nobody wants to punish anybody for any bad behavior at all of any kind. And this is why we can't have nice things. This is why, right? And maybe that punishment is way more extreme than you realize. Also, maybe it is. Like, maybe it should be. I don't know. Just saying, doing nothing, which is what we've been doing, is really not a great strategy and doesn't work out, at least in the biblical stories. So, or any others that I ever read. Maybe you've read differently, but comment below if you can find a story where this isn't the pattern.
So I want to respond to this. Knowing the name of a monster makes it not scary. It's like, nope. Like sometimes knowing the name of a monster makes it way more scary.
Shelob. Horrific
like
and awful.
Leviathan, like we can go, like, there's forces that you can't do anything about. Like looking them in the eyes is not gonna make your life better. So it's important to realize. Like, don't name a demon if you can't exercise it. There, like.
Yeah, there is an aspect also of naming something that you wind up there's a little bit of a connection to it at that point, that you wind up kind of remembering it, like actually attaching yourself to it. And then at that point, it's just like, okay, well, how do I get rid of this thing? And maybe, like if you name somebody, like you identify someone and it's like, oh, there's that guy, and that guy actually is a monster or something like that. It's like, maybe he heard his name get called. It's just like, oh, who's talking about me? I better go and say hello. It's just like, it's better to just kind of leave these things undone unless you're confident in that area.
Are we okay with this page? I guess we are. So at the top it kind of says, in general, dressing refers to the strict imposition of meaning upon matter, right? So you could see it as a spiritual cloak or something that holds the matter or informs the matter effectively, and without the meaning, like it 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 loses purpose, I guess, or participation in anything.
Well, I think the point here, Manuel, and it's probably not really super clear, but the way I would parse this is to say, you whenever you dress anything, and any usage of the word dressing, by the way, because you can dress a deer when you know when you go to take it to slaughter. Any manner of dressing implies a purpose or a final cause or a telos, right? And that's why it has meaning, right? So the idea that you're going to take an action of dressing, even if the dressing is putting on your clothes, implies that there's a purpose, right? That those clothes are going to serve, which is why you're taking the action. Because all actions are the result of purpose or final cause is a better way to say it. And that's why dressing is an imposition of meaning, right? The meaning comes from the final cause and the interaction of the final cause with the action, and the action in this case is a strict imposition via dressing. And I think if you think, and you have to think about it a little bit backward. This is why being dyslexic is a superpower. You have to think about it a little bit backwards. But once you think about it backwards, it kind of makes sense as to why he's saying that's a strict imposition of meaning. Because you're always dressing for a reason. There's something behind it. And that purpose or reason, you may get it wrong because you suck and that people aren't perfect or something. And we don't even live in a perfect world. It's way worse than you thought. But that's what's happening. And if you impose a bad meaning, we'll say bad things can happen for sure. So meaning doesn't solve a problem, contrary to what say that Vervaeke people would like you to believe. It's certainly required, but it ain't going to solve no problems. That's for sure. Because you suck, you're imperfect, and the world sucks and is imperfect.
So I want to contrast that with suiting, right? I think suiting is the other side of the coin. So it's assuming a dress. So you can send out. So you dress something. So that's an imposition of will or meaning, and suit is the receiving of will or meaning.
This reminds me a lot, so something fairly recently that I learned about is that a lot of monks wear this thing. They call it like the cord of Saint Philomena, and it's basically just like a string, like a very, very thin little string rope that I think has like a few like tiny little knots or something, very, very small, cheap little thing. But it was something that, they make their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And if they're experiencing temptations contrary to the virtue of chastity, they specifically put this on because Saint Philomena was a young girl who was a martyr, and like very, very old, big history with her, that there's a really popular devotion. But that was something that these guys would go and they would wear this. And this is basically, we talk about like the girdles, like the string with the leaves. It's basically that minus the leaves. So you get dressed with this thing that doesn't dress you. And the goal is actually specifically for rectifying the issues of, oh gosh, now these, passions or whatever, I got to cover up my nakedness or some sort of thing. And it's like, oh, that sort of lack of meaning, these guys do this and they experience, it's part of also a larger devotion and stuff. But by having that final cause that they go into, and then also the historical meaning, that they wear this sort of thing, and they actually wear it like all the time, like just 100% of the time, and like they even shower with this and all this stuff. That they just remain dressed in this thing that doesn't dress them, and that is itself kind of addressing just with meaning, and they find a night and day difference in their experience of these temptations.
Yeah, so that brings me to like tattoos, stuff like that, right? Those are also forms of permanent addressing, and you could even say scars, right? Like or trauma, right? Which is mental scarring. Um, like you're dressed with these things, right? Like you're wearing these all the time, and then sometimes they're reminding you, and they're weighing on you. Um, and
Kind of a seal. Yeah.
yeah, well, so the seal was brought up earlier, right? In closing the flesh of Adam after Eve was taken out. So um, a seal, right? Because that's the pressing on of, yeah, is it? Well, I guess it is dressing, right? Like it's the inheriting of meaning from a higher authority, right? So you like if someone seals you or seals the letter or whatever, right? Like basically what they're saying is like the space within the letter is my will, right? Like that's why you do it, right? Like it's authentically my will, and it's not tampered with, right? And in some sense, like it has my blessing. Um, so um, yeah, I, with a tattoo that would be like to self sign, right? Like that would be self-referential. Um, and with a scar, that would be the imposition of nature, I guess, or maybe if you got it fighting or whatever, like that would be the imposition of another human. Um,
Isn't there a thing where, both in kind of like old pagan tradition, whether it's kind of like Native American or like Old Norse and that sort of thing, that if a person had been, like in a fight with an animal or something like that, and that it left some sort of mark, that actually had something to do with their identity later on, that it had kind of like more or less sealed who they were, and become kind of like an outward representation of who that person was on the inside or something.
well, you can wear it, right?
Mm.
Like people wear their scars as a badge of pride, right? So, and I think that's correct because like that's the integration of it, right? Like you let the thing that defines you define you, right? But like you don't let it define you in a manner that is yoking you, right? Like let it define you in a manner that you let it serve you.
Well, there's that like the tiger becoming the ornament of the city type of thing.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know if that completely maps in my mind, but
Maybe not completely. I don't know. I'm
well, no,
kind of thinking like, here's the thing
it's
I
more.
wouldn't want.
Well, it's no, like in the Netherlands we have like the remembrance of the dead of the Second World War, right? And so like every year we have a couple minutes of silence to remember them. And that's a wound, right?
Mm.
That's a scar. And it's given a place, right? Like and it's actively participating in the collective identity of the nation. And or in other words, like that's Moses putting the stick with the snake, right? So it's lifting up the thing so that we don't fall into the mistake again, right? And now we've obviously made the mistake of not remembering what the mistake was if we ever knew. Right? It's like, yeah. Um,
Do we want to go over this diagram and how
sure.
ridiculously well fractally scaled it is? Because I think like this is, yeah, and this is also what we're not doing, right? Like if you want to see the breakdown in real time, just notice how what we're doing in the world does not map at all to this diagram, right? Because we don't have these senses, right? This idea of the mediation of flooded and dry land, right? The mediation of nature versus culture, right? Because culture is imposing on nature now, right? That's and when you do that too much, say the city gets too big, right? And that's related to naked versus dressed. And so we're not cleaning our room, all right? And so that's kicking up a layer, right? The opposite direction of the diagram will say, right? And then humanity is not minding nature and culture explicitly, right? People are saying like, what is reality? How do we know real? And I'm like, if that's the question you're asking, no one can help you. You are like, you need to go outside. As you need to do. Like, reality will impose itself real fast. Just go outside. You'll figure it out real quick. Stay out there for a long time. The reality will be all around you, right? And then because of that, we're in a flood because we can't mediate the 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 the, the dry land, and everything's moving too fast. Is it really now? I mean, you can measure that things are moving too fast, right? And so that's the flooded time. And you can see this at the breakdown at all levels, right? But the only level you actually operate at is getting dressed. Damn it, that's it. Like, come out of sleep, do your standing, your work a day, create the order, and the rest of it will trickle up. But that's your only option.
Yeah, so I want to say that if you have a culture and you are settled somewhere, you have to stand up for it. Like you can't, like, the communal scale requires, right? You're bound. And if you don't bind yourself, like, the connection isn't there. Well, like, and to be fair to all the postmoderns, like, it's not real to them because, like, they're not bound. So they're and what ends up happening is, well, yeah, now you're in exile, right? You're in permanent exile, and you're trying to settle in your exile. That's what everybody's doing. Like, what's a world citizen? Well, like, well, just live half a year there and half a year there and half a year there. And it's like, okay, but what are you doing, right? Like basically what you're doing is you're chasing something, right? You're chasing a fantasy, a dream, literally, right? And and so you're following that dream, and at a certain point, everything will fall apart, right? Because that dream cannot sustain you. Like it can only guide you. And like Castle, I like the way that he phrased it. It's like, well, I've been building up all these things inside of me, and then when I rested, they just all appeared. It's like, yeah, that's happening, and that's happening on a collective scale as well. Right? We've been building up tons of things, and they're gonna appear.
And they have been, but also, and I think more importantly, someone is paying the cost for you to live your dream. Pay very close attention to that. It may not be somebody you know, and it may be 100 people or 1,000 people, right? And for you to have your dreams, those people are effectively your slaves. And that's what you need to realize. And that's actually a theme that's come up in the past week or two. Can't remember which. Don't get sick. It messes with your time memory. But that's actually come up. I've seen that come up on my timelines on Facebook and X. And I'm like, oh, how interesting. People are finally starting to notice, like, slavery is not an optional state. Like, and the more affluence you have, the more slaves you have effectively. And you have to recognize that, because if you don't take care of them, they will revolt, and then more things will appear, and you don't want that. And we might have already seen that, let's say with certain shooting on New York City, right? Like, well, you haven't been paying attention, and now these things are going to happen. And that's tip of the iceberg. We're not even close. This is the pre-beginning. Things are going to get a lot worse. Just saying.
I just wanted to kind of mention A bit. Well, first, there's a certain point I was going to make that I have temporarily lost, so I'm gonna, buy time here for a second. But I just want to point out the motion that's kind of happening in the diagram. So to Mark's point about the trickling up, that not only like there's a reciprocal motion that's also happening with the mediation at these different scales. So you can actually look at the shape of the diagram, and not only is there kind of a popping out of these different lower scales, but also there is kind of a returning back that's happening back in there. So just to the point of kind of like doing the mediation of just getting dressed and cleaning your room and everything, that motion is depicted in this specific area of the book.
I like that. Let me make one other quick point that I didn't think of before. One way to think about all this is to say that when you're young, so we'll say you're not yet an adult, you're still, say, under the auspices of your parents, we'll just use 18, that's what we use in the US. That very much flows from left to right. And there's no choice about that. And I think one of the struggles people are having, and this was, I know it's not popular anymore, but it was popular about maybe 10 years ago, the adulting movement. That's the struggle with making it go from right to left, right? Where you move from being taken care of by the things above you to having to revivify or take care of the things above you as the result of growing up and being an adult. And so that might be maturity, right? These are all themes you're seeing all over the place if you're watching anything at all, movies, TV, anything on the internet, Facebook, Twitter, everything, right? You're seeing these like, oh, people haven't grown up, or they haven't matured, or they're not right because they're not giving back to the thing they were born into. And it's very much a rejection of having been born into something. I call that creation denial, because that's actually where it starts and ends at the end of the day. And so you have to contribute back up, or the things that have been supporting you, because everybody's being supported by them and nobody's putting back in, will collapse. And that's why you'll hear the word Ponzi scheme everywhere. It's like, well, it's not a Ponzi scheme if you're not a parasite on it for your whole life. Some things are Ponzi schemes, sure. Some things are not, however. They're based in very sound principles that if you use this when you need it and then give back in, everybody wins. And actually, proper insurance is based on that principle. We can argue whether or not we have that anymore, but that's what it is, right? If everybody gives a little, the people who have the catastrophes will get taken care of. Yep, absolutely. There are better ways to do that, I would argue, but they all require looking up and like cooperating in a common higher structure of some weird nature. I don't know. We might call that church or something, like, just off the top of my head.
So actually, I think in the Netherlands, you're forced to be insured, but there's exemptions for certain religious communities, I think. So because they have their own collectivisms in that sense, right? So I think that's a leftover of a recognition of a previous order. But we'll get into this next week. But I want to say, right, like I think the proper way of thinking is that everything is an image of the cosmic scale, right? So the cosmic scale has the real pattern, and then it gets more specific if you go from the generalization to the specification to the individual, right? And I think what Mark is talking about with giving back, right? I think that's after you're born again, right? So I think you're getting born into the image of the cosmic scale. And when you're born into the cosmic scale, your participation can correctly give back to that cosmic scale. And if you're not born again, right, then you're going to have a crooked participation that's trying to give back because you're not embedded correctly, right? Like you're not attending to the right things, and you're going to give to other things than the cosmic scale. You're going to give maybe just to the community or whatever, right? Which might not be a big deal as long as the community itself is oriented correctly, right? And now we're going to talk about heads, right? Okay, it's fine to have a, a bunch of people who are not oriented completely correctly as long as the whole is oriented correctly, but then you need to orient the whole correctly. Um, oh yeah, and so like I think it's also important to try and see the cosmic in the other layers, right? And not try to see the cosmic layer through the lesser layers, right? Like they might give you a sign, right? Like they might give you a way to the cosmic scale, but things should be understood from the cosmic scale, not from the individual scale. Um, and I guess I want to land the plane. Anybody in the comments, please leave some final questions or whatever that we can pick them up. Christopher, do you want to say something?
Well, I was just thinking that what you were talking about there, seeing things from the cosmic scale, whatever. If you get that backwards, that's when you're trying to live in your dream and trying to organize,
Mm.
everything according to your dream, from yourself to everything instead of like receiving the cosmic thing from above and orienting yourself to that.
Yeah, that was really good. I like it. Um, yeah, so we're gonna try and do a minute of integration. Mitchell, I'd advise you to partake in this because like this is like the most important part. We need to digest the food that we've just been eating, um, and um, when we're doing integration, we're picking a frame to understand our participation from. So does anybody have a suggestion? Maybe that what Christopher said is the proper inspiration. It's like how are we living in a dream? Which parts of our lives are we dreaming instead of listening to the truth coming down on us? So we'll take like a minute to reflect upon it, and then we'll discuss it and we'll engage with any questions from the chat. Okay, who wants to share their insights?
So I remembered the point that I had before I so rudely interrupted myself. So there's this there's an interesting kind of line of reasoning that I heard years ago. Where this guy was talking about the aspect of receiving financial aid to become a doctor, and he was saying, essentially, society paid to be to have a doctor, to mark the point of these, everyone essentially being enslaved at a certain scale for producing some sort of thing. And it's not a problem if they actually get the doctor, right? Then it's just like, okay, you give back, doctor happens, you get the doctor, you go do a doctor, and then everyone gets what they paid for, and like you're okay. But then you get these scenarios, and it's not like it's necessarily easier cut and dry, but you get a scenario where, say there's a someone who's studied to be a doctor, and maybe they decide to be a stay-at-home mom, or maybe they want a career change, they do some sort of different thing, and then it's like, okay, well, society, a certain subset of the society became enslaved for this purpose at a certain scale, paid for something, and then didn't get it. So you are having this sort of thing of there is the dream that was paid for, and now it's actually been cut off and become just a self-referential sort of thing. That is just like, well, it's not actually going anywhere. It was meant to be going somewhere, and then it gets completely cut off. But then, you do wind up getting this. There's an opportunity there for that higher participation, but it's like in order to really rectify that and not then yourself become enslaved to being a doctor, if you like really hate it or it's just not realistic or something like that, that it is essentially to then have a sort of higher participation at the a more kind of larger communal or cosmic scale in order to kind of rectify this unbalance. And so I look at some of these people like not specifically with like a doctor type scenario, but you look at, I think now her title is Servant of God, Dorothy Day, where she had like a crazy life. And it was just like, it was really not good. But then she actually wound up outpacing people essentially in pretty much every sort of aspect of caring for the poor and all these other things, that the enormous cost that she had kind of, or, the bill she had racked up was also in a sense an opportunity, a lot like these things with like the city of Nineveh, or these things where it has an opportunity to be like, okay, well, this is headed towards hell, right? Like this is just, it's not looking good. The slingshot band has been pulled all the way back, and everything. It's like, well, there is an opportunity there to decide to just kind of start doing the work and then come back, and there is a certain level of not just, okay, now I need to get back up to 100% from zero. It's getting back up to 100% from -75 or something like that. That there's a larger amount of growth, but there is also a greater capacity for exemplification. So you can, by kind of going that far down to the depths, there's actually a larger capacity if you choose to participate, to do greater demonstration than if you had never done anything wrong. So I guess that was sort of an insight that I had gleaned.
Okay. So I was thinking about the dreaming. So I got three types of dream. One is letting go without a requisite structure holding you, right? So then you just drift off. You're going in a fantasy, or maybe I don't know the English word, but it's a delusion, I guess. um, and then another way to dream is to look for things, right? And when you look for things, then you're not receptive to the things that come at you. So you put on blinders. Um, and then the third one I got is you get dragged into distractions. So you end up hopping from one thing to the other. You don't bind, you don't connect, no intimacy. And also that's a lack of a clean space, right? So Like you need to remove things. I think we were talking about this a while back. Like in order to pay certain attention, you need to remove a bunch of things so that you free up the space that you can even hear in the first place, right? So um, I think we run into this problem with a lot of conversations that we're having. Is like people's heads are so full of stuff that they can't even listen, right? Like so they don't have the space to to hear you, even if they could hear you, which is probably not the case. Like they don't have the space to give you a place. So yeah, that and then if we follow any of these things without imposing, right, to impose our will and redirect things, then we just end up in a dream world. Anyone else? Okay, well, thanks everybody for watching and for the nice participation in the chat. I think that was really contributing to our exploration. So I hope to see you all next week and maybe read up on the book, and then you can hop in and join the discussion. So till next week.